guys, happy holidays! The case we're talking about today is one not for the faint of heart. So all of the cases I talk about are pretty messed up, but this one is disturbing on a whole other level. This case is called the Covina Christmas Eve Massacre, and it's also known as the Santa Claus of Covina. So this massacre actually somewhat inspired the 2012 horror film Silent Night, where a man dressed up as Santa terrorizes a Christmas Eve party. As everyone knows, Christmas is the time of year where families come together and celebrate how much they love each other. And that's just what the Ortega family was known for. Every year on Christmas Eve, Alicia, who I read went by Alice, and Joseph Ortega would invite their 5 adult children and their families over for a Christmas Eve party. The Ortegas would also invite their friends over for said party to celebrate their favorite time of year with everyone they loved most. The Ortega family consisted of mom and dad, Alice and Joseph, their 2 sons, Charles and James, and their 3 daughters, Leticia, Alicia, and Sylvia. Of course, the children went on to get married and have children of their own, so overall, the Ortega family was pretty big and filled with lots of love. Joseph and Alice lived in Covina, which is a suburb about 22 miles from Los Angeles, California. They lived in a close-knit, quiet, and relatively safe cul-de-sac at 1129 East Knollcrest Drive. On Christmas Eve 2008, the Ortegas held their annual Christmas Eve party in which about 26 of their closest friends and family attended. But this party would end much differently than all of the others. After their delicious Christmas Eve dinner, the party started to wind down. Most of the grandchildren were busy playing video games and hanging out by the pool in the backyard, while the adults in the Ortega family gathered around the dining room table to play a friendly game of Texas Hold'em. On the second floor of the house, the Ortega's 17-year-old grandson Michael was keeping himself busy playing on the computer. At around 11:30 p.m., 8-year-old Katrina, who is Leticia's daughter, saw something out of the corner of her eye walking in the front lawn, and then all of a sudden there was a knock on the front door. When Katrina opened the door, she was greeted by a man dressed up as Santa Claus, who was holding a present in his hands. And like every 8-year-old kid, she was extremely excited and yelled, "Santa, Santa!" But what happened next is horrifying. The man pulled out a 9mm semi-automatic handgun and shot Katrina in the face. Of course, it didn't take long after this for panic to ensue, and everyone in the house tried running for shelter. The man opened fire and sprayed bullets throughout the entire house, shooting anyone he came into contact with. During the chaos, someone actually yelled, quote, "It's Bruce," end quote. But the cry was drowned out with the sound of the firing gun. The man shot Charles and James, and although they were severely wounded, they tried getting up to tackle the shooter. However, it was no use and they were unsuccessful. Joseph, Alice, and their 3 daughters all took cover behind the dining room table, but the shooter made his way into the kitchen and shot each of them. All except Leticia, who, after witnessing her 8-year-old daughter stagger out of the house after being shot in the face, made a break for it. She somehow safely made it with her husband and daughter to the neighbor's house, where she was able to call 911. And as for the others in the house, police speculate that the shooter actually stood over some of his victims and shot them execution style. Once he ran out of bullets, the shooter unwrapped the present he was holding, which was a rolling air compressor that he filled with high-octane fuel, which he somehow converted into a homemade flamethrower. The shooter proceeded to spray 18 gallons of gasoline throughout the house. But what he didn't know was that somewhere in the house was an open flame, and as the man sprayed the gas and began to use his flamethrower, the house essentially exploded and became engulfed in flames. A 20-year-old woman who was stuck on the 2nd floor actually jumped out of a window trying to save herself. She broke her ankle in the process, but otherwise made it out safely. Sadly, though, 17-year-old Michael, who was playing on his computer on the 2nd floor, died as a result of the explosion. In the midst of this, neighbors of the Ortegas witnessed the house on fire, and the 911 calls started pouring in.
He shot, I heard the shots, and they were like poppers, and I wasn't sure what it was, so everyone started panicking and running, so we all dove into the dining room. Some of us dove, some of us went up. He's shooting. He's shooting.
What's your address? Ma'am, I understand. I need to know your address.
My daughter's been shot. She was shot in the face on the side, and she's bleeding.
I know. I let the officers know. The officers are making sure it's safe for the paramedics to
I
come
need a
in.
bandage.
When the police and fire crew arrived, they walked into a nightmare. The fire took 80 firefighters an hour and a half to extinguish, and by then, everyone that was still in the house had burned. And because of the horrible state of their remains, the victims had to be identified with medical and dental records. The victims are as followed: Joseph and Alice, Charles, James, Cherry Lynn, Teresa, Alicia, Michael, and Sylvia Ortega. The only child of the Ortega family that survived was Leticia. Her daughter Katrina, who was shot in the face, survived as the bullet grazed her jaw. So in total, 9 people died, 3 others were wounded, and at least 13 children were orphaned because of this massacre. During the investigation, a neighbor stated that they saw a Dodge Caliber leaving the cul-de-sac at around 11:45 p.m. without its lights on and thought it was suspicious. On the same night of the massacre, police in Sylmar, California, which is about 40 miles from Covina, were called to the home of Brad Pardo. Brad returned to his home after a night out at a Christmas party and found his brother, 45-year-old Bruce Pardo, lying dead in a pool of his own blood. And just beside him lay a 9mm handgun. LA County Coroner Lieutenant Fred Corral quickly ruled Bruce's death a suicide, as there was an exit wound at the top of his head, suggesting that he put the gun in his mouth before pulling the trigger. So investigators started looking into Bruce's past and found that he was married to none other than Sylvia Ortega, one of the victims of the Covina massacre. Authorities found that the couple had actually finalized their divorce not even a full week prior to both of their deaths, and because of this, investigators knew that this was not a coincidence. Authorities interviewed Leticia, and she was able to tell them the shooter was without a doubt 100% Bruce Pardo. And if you remember, at the party during the shooting, somebody actually witnessed him as well and yelled, "It's Bruce," but at the time, there was just way too much going on and nobody was able to really piece it together. It wasn't long before police located the Dodge Caliber in question, which had been parked just a block away from where Bruce died. After running the plates, authorities found that it was a rental car that had been rented by Bruce. Inside the car were 4 handguns with 200 rounds of ammunition and a Santa suit. Somehow, and I can't really find an article explaining what fully happened, the car was considered highly dangerous, and so the bomb squad was called in. And while they were there, they accidentally set the car on fire while trying to remove the Santa suit. Authorities then searched Bruce's home in Montrose, where they found a shotgun, a container for high-octane fuel gasoline, and found what they described as a virtual bomb factory. Investigators knew that Bruce was the one who committed this horrific crime, but they needed to figure out why. And thus began the dissection into his life. So Bruce graduated from John H. Francis Polytechnic High School in Sun Valley, Los Angeles, and went on to also graduate from California State University, Northridge. He met the beautiful Sylvia Ortega in 2004, who had 3 children from a previous relationship. The two fell in love, and in 2006 they were married. But it wasn't long after they were married that Sylvia started to see some red flags. The two grew apart as Bruce refused to open up a joint banking account with Sylvia and straight up refused to help her financially care for her 3 children. Since they weren't technically his kids, he wanted her to do it all by herself. Another red flag that many speculate was what led to the couple's divorce was that Bruce was essentially hiding a whole secret past life from Sylvia. So Bruce reportedly had been married once before and actually had a son from that marriage. So one day his ex-wife needed to run to the store to go grocery shopping, so she left Bruce and their very young son alone at the house, which should have been okay. But somehow their son ended up in their pool, and by the time Bruce noticed, he was blue, unconscious, and limp. When his ex-wife returned, she saw Bruce holding their child with a completely blank stare on his face, like not even trying to help him. She rushed her son to the hospital where he luckily survived, but he suffered severe brain trauma and became paralyzed, and is now in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. So after this, Bruce actually left them, and after a while, he completely stopped financially supporting his child and ex-wife. He almost acted as if that part of his life never existed. But the most disgusting thing is that although Bruce seemingly wanted nothing to do with his child, he still claimed him as a dependent for tax purposes. In the midst of the divorce in June of 2008, Bruce was court-ordered to pay Sylvia $1,700 a month in spousal support, which he did for a short while. But almost right after this, Bruce was fired from his job for fraudulently billing clients hours that he didn't actually work, or, in other words, stealing company money. After he was fired, his monthly spousal support payments were waived. A few months later, Bruce was then required to pay Sylvia a lump sum of $10,000 as part of the divorce settlement. According to court documents, Sylvia was able to keep her wedding ring and their family dog, which really angered Bruce. Bruce complained about having to pay her such a high amount because he stated that she didn't really have any bills to pay and that she had bought a luxury car and was eating out at expensive restaurants and all the like. Because of all of this information, police speculate that Bruce committed this massacre because of his marital problems with Sylvia, the extremely fresh divorce, and the fact that his life was just going downhill really fast. When authorities found Bruce, he had $17,000 cling wrapped to his legs. He also had a list with him that included a few names. Those names were Sylvia, their divorce attorney Scott Nord, and Bruce's own mother. It was deemed a hit list of everyone that he had planned to kill that night. So upon further digging, police found that Bruce had bought an airline ticket departing that night, and it was suspected that his original plan was to flee to Canada as the ticket was to fly on Air Canada. But the ticket itself was actually from Los Angeles to Moline, Illinois, where an old high school friend of his lived at the time. Bruce reportedly called this friend days before the massacre and told him that he was going to come and visit him. But this was likely just to throw investigators off. Around the same time, a man called police about a mysterious car that had been parked in front of his home in Pasadena that wasn't supposed to be there. After police ran its plates, it turned out to be another rental car rented by Bruce. The car was packed with supplies, including a computer, clothes, water, food, and maps of the US and Mexico. So it seemed to be pretty clear that after the attack, Bruce was planning to flee and start a new life somewhere. But instead, he ended his own life. This caused a lot of confusion, as this didn't seem to be his original plan. But during the massacre, after Bruce set off the explosion, he accidentally set himself on fire and severely burned his body. He had third-degree burns on his arms, and it was so incredibly bad that pieces of the Santa suit had actually melted into his skin. Authorities speculate that he was likely in excruciating pain, to the point where he couldn't continue down his list of killing people and instead took his own life. And that is essentially the entire story of the Covina Christmas Eve massacre. So after the massacre, Leticia, who was the only child of the Ortega family to survive, went on to create a blog called Leticia's Hope, where she writes about everything she went through and how it made her stronger as a person. She and her daughter Katrina, who also survived that night after being shot in the face, now advocate for others who have been affected by gun violence. Just in the time that I was researching this case, I learned how strong-willed and positive they both are, and I've never even met them personally. Alright everyone, I hope you have a safe holiday and can spend some time with those you love. I'll see you all next time, but until then, stay safe.